this is a great night to watch a movie and have some conversation. Thank you for coming out in this weather on this chilly evening and being here at the Cathedral. My name's Randy Hollworth, and I'm the Dean of the Cathedral, and on behalf of Mary Ann Buddy, the Bishop of Washington, and all of us who serve this cathedral, we're really glad to have you here tonight for the second annual Long Day event. For those of you who might not realize it, the name of this comes from Dr. Martin Luther King's remarks that we've come a long way and we still have a long way to go when it comes to racial justice and reconciliation. And that certainly is the case, as we see, unfortunately, every single day in the news. I want to thank our sponsors for this event. First and foremost, Greg Garrett of Baylor University. Right here, Greg, who brought the idea to us and the funding. He's been integral to this whole thing these last couple of years, envisioning and developing this opportunity. Greg is a wonderful author, preacher, professor at Baylor, and he's also the theologian in residence at the American Cathedral in Paris. That's a pretty good gig. He'll be part of tonight's program. I also want to thank the Austin Film Festival for their sponsorship and the March on Washington Film Festival for their sponsorship, and they're new this year with us, so thank you all for that. Let's thank. I also want to take a moment to thank one of our own here at the Cathedral, Michelle Dibley, who is our Director of Programming and who works tirelessly to put together these really wonderful events that bring so many of us together in the city for a variety of different conversations that are so important. Michelle, will you stand up for just a minute? The film this weekend is part of the National Cathedral's efforts to lift up racial justice and reconciliation as some of the most important work, if not the most important work that needs to take place in our country today. This is part of what we understand as this cathedral's role as a convener, as a place to bring people together in peace and in fellowship, to have sometimes difficult conversations, always important conversations, and to grow together as a society and a community. And also importantly for us to look at some of these issues through what we think of as the light of the gospel, and what the gospel has to tell us about how we treat and love our neighbors. Now, this is a rich topic and a rich opportunity for reflection, to talk about where we've come from and where we're going on the issues of race in this country. And so tonight we're watching Do the Right Thing. It's the 30th anniversary year of Do the Right Thing, which I gotta say freaks me out a little bit. It makes me feel old. Followed tomorrow by an afternoon workshop and then the showing of BlacKkKlansman in the evening. So to kick off tonight's event, I want to welcome up to the podium Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, who is the canon theologian here at the Washington National Cathedral. Not quite as sweet as Paris, but not a bad gig. And she's also the Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, and Professor Greg Garrett of Baylor University. Would you welcome them to the podium?
Thank you, and thank you for all being here on this evening, for not only the viewing of this film, but for the important conversations that will follow. No film takes place in a vacuum, and that certainly is the case for Do the Right Thing. Do the Right Thing was released in the summer of 1989. At the time of its release, many accused Spike Lee of being irresponsible because they believed the film to be inflammatory and that it would lead to riotous uprisings in the Black community. For the film was indeed released at the end of a decade when Black Americans were most vulnerable to a series of racially motivated acts of hate and violence. There was Michael Stewart in 1983, who died at the hands of a police chokehold in New York City for the crime of spray painting graffiti on a subway wall. There was Eleanor Bunkers in 19 1984, an elderly black woman shot and killed in her own apartment by police who were there to evict her. And then there was the Central Park 5 in 1989, 5 black teens who were falsely accused of assaulting and raping a white female jogger. And then there was Yusef Hawkins. In 1989, a 16-year-old black teen who was jumped and killed by a group of white teens for the crime of being black in the wrong neighborhood, Bensonhurst, a working-class Italian neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. So for Lee, the film Do the Right Thing was a way to open a dialogue about race and to address the issues and concerns of Black America that were being ignored. It provided a way into an experience and a conversation that people otherwise might not have. And so we opened our long way film, race and film festival this year with Do the Right Thing as a way to open, to provide a way to an experience and a conversation 30 years later, at a time where the themes of 1989 and the issues and concerns of 1989 remain with us today. And so we hope that the film will be, for all of us sitting here, the beginning of new insights, new questions, and new conversations.
So that you can be watching and paying attention to some things, and we'll be talking about these, of course, afterward when we have conversation about it. As Kelly pointed out, when the film came out in 1989, a number of film critics and cultural critics said that it was irresponsible, even dangerous. And Roger Ebert talked about how when he saw the film with a bunch of other people at the Cannes Film Festival, the buzz among the film critics there was that this was a film that would incite racial violence when it was shown in America. But Roger Ebert's conclusion about it was very different. He said, Do the Right Thing comes closer to reflecting the current state of race relations in America than any other movie of our time. It is cinematically powerful. As we watch it tonight, pay attention to the hot colors, to Ernest Dickerson's cinematography, to Bill Lee's jazz score interspersed with the pounding repetition of Public Enemy's Fight the Power. What Spike Lee is doing is putting these characters and this story directly in our faces on the hottest day of the year in Bedford-Stuyvesant. The movie gives us contrasts, mutually exclusive choices that we are asked to somehow reconcile as audience members. And while it highlights a racist society and the violence and oppression done against black bodies, one of the great gifts of the film is that it also points out the prejudice that all of us nurse for someone, somewhere. It's one of the most entertaining, great movies that I know. It will make you laugh, it will make you cry, it will make you angry, and it will make you think. Roger Ebert's conclusion about the film seems as true 30 years later as when he wrote this review. Anyone who leaves the movie with more intolerance than they walked in with wasn't paying attention. So we are so excited to welcome you tonight to this first evening of Long, Long Way. And it is now my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight. Some of you are listeners to Morning Edition, and you may have heard an advertisement that's going on now about how people start their days. In my house, my wife cannot consider herself a member of the human race until she's had like 3 really strong cups of coffee. But for me, I cannot consider myself a member of the human race until I get in my car and turn on the radio and hear my 10 favorite morning words. Live from NPR News in Washington, this is Korva Coleman. It is such a joy to welcome back Korva Coleman, who so many of us depend on as a calm, smart, sane, and thoughtful voice even when the news of the day is anything but calm, smart, sane, and thoughtful. In the 2 years of working with her, she has also proven to be the same sort of moderator, asking brilliant questions, invoking brilliant conversation. And I am so excited to have her back this year as our moderator for Long, Long Way. Please welcome Korva Coleman.
Well, hello. Thanks, Greg. I'm so glad you could come out tonight to share this evening with us. And I really appreciate that you came through the winter weather and that you're chilly and most of you are still sitting in your jackets. I'm going to wrap up too. So I want to tell you a little bit about this evening, and then we are going to sit down and we'll start the film. But the first thing I would like to do is to let you know that at the conclusion of the film, we're going to stand up and take a few minutes and stretch, because that way we can prepare ourselves for the panel conversation that follows. And during that time that we stretch, we're going to be welcoming Dr. Linda Livingstone, who is the president of Baylor College. She'll join us for a few minutes and speak a few words, so we'll look forward to that. And then we're going to start our panel discussion. So you've already met a couple of our panelists tonight. With us is Kelly and Greg, but we have two more who are sitting with us. Mr. Van Newkirk of the Atlantic magazine. I'd like to welcome him. And I'd also like to welcome the Reverend Dr. Yolanda Pierce, Dean of Howard Divinity School. And they're just going to wave their hands. So, I need you to be prepared, if you haven't seen it yet, for some tough stuff. I need you to be prepared for questions and hard thoughts. I need you to be prepared for the use of the word giddy bastard and nigger. I need you to be ready for that. I need you to be thinking about what Spike Lee was trying to communicate, not to just one part of American society, but to all of us. What is the right thing? How should we go along together? Let's find out.
I'd like to invite Dr. Linda Livingstone, president of Baylor University, to say a few words about Baylor and their really fantastic support for this program. So we're glad you can be with us this year. Thank you so much, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. You're welcome to continue to stretch after watching the movie. It's such a privilege to be here as part of this festival and this opportunity for discussion over some really significant issues. And we're certainly appreciative of the Cathedral, of Dean Hollerith, and other partners in this to make it possible to do this. And as we begin Black History Month, what a powerful way to begin that with such a challenging movie. And I know we're going to have some wonderful scholars here and folks that are going to talk about that and share their perspectives. But it's really a privilege for us at Baylor to be involved here in the Washington, D.C. community. I was privileged to live here for 3 years before returning to Baylor. And you know, it just brings so many people together from so many walks of life and so many perspectives. And it gives us an opportunity here with events like this, with the programs we have here with our students, with the work that we're doing with Georgetown on religious liberty, to really struggle and think through some difficult issues, and frankly give us an opportunity as a faith-based institution to think about how do we bring together people from a broad perspectives from across faith traditions and think about how we work through these difficult issues of racial reconciliation and equality and justice. And so we appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank all of you for joining us this evening, and I look forward to the conversation and hearing your perspectives on what we just had the privilege of watching. So thank you very much.
Hello. Did you all stretch? Good. Me too. Well, there was so much in that film that I had forgotten. Did you catch the Trump reference?
Yeah.
How about that? Some things change and some things stay the same. I'd like to welcome our panelists tonight. Immediately here to my right, the Reverend Dr. Yolanda Pierce, Dean, Howard Divinity School. Hi, Yolanda. Mr. Van Newkirk from The Atlantic, here in the middle. And of course, Dr. Greg Garrett of Baylor University. Welcome, Greg. I'd like to begin our conversation tonight by asking each of our panelists to give us a short reflection on this very modern 30-year-old film. Yolanda?
So I had two thoughts that were really resonating with me watching this film. The first was about this question of do the right thing. It is, for those of us who do theology and religion, it's an ethical question. And so I've been marinating on what does it mean to do the right thing when the answer is messy and complicated and it is not black and white. And I think the second piece that really struck me is that when the film came out 30 years ago, it was filmed in my neighborhood in Brooklyn. I lived in this exact area. We actually went to watch them as they were filming, but I wasn't old enough yet to actually go to see the movie. And now, 30 years later, that neighborhood in Brooklyn doesn't look anything like that. My family has been displaced. The school that I went to is no longer there. And so I think about the violence of gentrification. It was alluded to in the film, but I experienced it myself as I watched literally a neighborhood in which I played as a little girl, which no longer exists. And so there's something prophetic about what Spike Lee does in this movie. Gentrification, climate change, violence, not just physical violence, not just racialized violence, but the violence of displacement, the displacing of people, the displacing of communities and histories and traditions. It's a powerful reflection 30 years later.
Van Newkirk.
So, for me, the thing that always stands out when I watch this film is, number one, just how beautiful it is, how well shot it is. The cinematography is fantastic. And I think after having spent a lot of the last couple years watching some Fences, for example, I think it's evident how much Spike Lee draws from different kinds of traditions of black cinema, of black drama. He brings in some of the August Wilson. He brings in the sort of long monologues, and I think they are specific callbacks to different eras and different segments of black art. The second thing that really gets me is having spent a lot of the time of the past couple years studying Dr. King. It becomes clear that this movie is pretty much a meditation on that photograph. That's the one photograph that exists of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. And when you look at it, you basically have to create in your mind a history of how those two people came together, how they met, what propelled them to one another there. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. But you could see the wheels in Spike's mind turning for coming up with basically how those two philosophies meet, where they meet in the middle, and how they define the black community. And I think you get the messiness of the final scenes in his meditation on that.
Greg?
What I was thinking about as I watched the movie tonight is how loud so much of the movie is, and how for much of the movie people are shouting at each other and past each other. And we were thinking about our present moment, and in some ways that seems to be what we do in our culture now. Instead of talking to each other, we talk past each other, we shout at each other, and it makes the actual conversations in the film that much more powerful. The conversation that Mookie has with Pino about his favorite actor and athlete, the conversation that Sal has with Pino at the table where he's talking about, these kids grew up on my pizza. And then that final conversation between Mookie and Sal at the end of the movie, where there's been like this incredible violence and this incredible noise, and here we are in the quiet, and what is it that we have to say to each other? And one of the reasons that we're here this weekend is to start an actual conversation where we listen to each other instead of shouting at each other or past each other. And I think this movie reminds us that our failure to talk to each other is the prelude to the violence that shocks us at the end of the film.
One of the things Spike Lee said was that he often got asked by people who were white, what is the right thing? And he almost never got asked that question by people who were black. Greg, I know you've taught courses around this class. How does it work in your class?
Yeah, and so Van and I were talking about this just the other night. For 30 years, Spike Lee has said that basically white people and black people see two different movies when they watch this. And so for white audiences, often there is this shock of property damage. And the allegiance that we have with the white characters in the film and the connection that we feel to Sal. And then, of course, the voice of reason is Mookie's, but, Radio Raheem is dead. And so I think the thing that we wrestle with is Spike Lee doesn't tell us what the right thing is. He sets up these situations that are in conflict, these, love, hate, black, white kind of situations, and he asks us to think about what the right thing might be. And so did Mookie do the right thing? I don't know. But Spike Lee asks us to think about the action in the film and to, have conversation about it and figure out what could the right thing have been in that situation.
Van, you want to add on to the conversation that you had with Greg?
Yeah. The idea that, again, meditating on the King versus Malcolm X question and the photograph there, he's really setting people up to think about, okay, what is the right thing if your frame of mind is black people need to seize power, seize the means of economic activity in our neighborhoods. What is the right thing, though, if you want to be nonviolent? How do you navigate those differences? How do you navigate those in a black community that is, I can't say it's dominated by any single one philosophy of this sort? And also, I think we were having this conversation about people seeing two different movies. I think if this movie were written by anybody other than Spike Lee, Sal is the main character, right? He's sort of the everyman. He's trying hard. He's a good man, and he does the things that would mark a good man in a movie. Yet the protagonist of the movie is a guy who throws a trash can through the window, who doesn't really take care of his kid. You have all these different layers, I think, and they give everybody this real richness and complexity. I think it's very interesting, and also it keeps us from being a one-dimensional morality play. Yeah, I think it takes us through all the different, what moves and propels people, and how all these different philosophies of black liberation and nonviolence and violence as revolutionary, how they all meet in the middle.
Yolanda, is there a theological perspective we should be thinking about?
I think this is exactly the theological perspective, which is we often want to put Malcolm X in one camp and Martin Luther King Jr. in another camp and suggest that those camps do not meet. but that's not the reality of how people live their real lives. And that's not even the reality of their own individual philosophies, that there's a lot of common ground as well as a lot of disagreement. And so are we comfortable with the messiness of this, right? Are we comfortable when the liberatory theology has to meet perhaps redemptive violence, right? Or are we, looking for those easy answers? I use this word prophetic, and I want to sort of lean into that a little bit, because as a theologian, when we talk about the prophetic, we're not talking about the ability to speak to the future, although I think Spike Lee does that beautifully in his movies. But the prophetic is the responsibility of telling the truth, right? And telling the truth when the truth is ugly and you're uneasy with the truth, and when the truth actually has consequences and repercussions. And so there's a truth telling. And that's why the stories are complicated. And that's why, the good guy character has to be complicated. And the guy who doesn't take care of his kids is also, we can't make him the bad guy. And so the ability for Spike Lee to be prophetic in this movie, I think really speaks to kind of the inner theology, even though Spike Lee himself wouldn't use those terms. He has a hostile relationship with the religion.
Part of me also thinks about looking back and thinking about what happened. Another way to look at it is Mookie threw the trash can through the window because if he hadn't, what would have happened to Sal and his sons? The police officers left. Those 3 men were unprotected. Is that another way to look at that?
This is clearly to me a meditation on riots too, and on what the function, not just necessarily of sort of a higher-minded revolutionary violence in terms of seizing power is, but also like the letting off steam violence, the long hot summer violence that King also talked about, and you get the kind of perspective where this is all evil. You're not supposed to destroy buildings. You're not supposed to set these things on fire. But you also get, I guess, the kind of philosophy where if you're destroying the buildings, you're able to exert some control over your environment without necessarily hurting people. He goes up and he says the insurance is going to cover it. It's fine. And that's clearly, what's going through Mookie's head when he throws a trash can, I think. They don't really think about the sort of the psychological damage and all that, but I think he is trying to grasp at the difference between the violence done to bodies, and that's the violence done to Radio Raheem, and the violence done to what we build, and those are different things to him.
I think, though, in addition to that, I'm thinking about the kind of psychic violence that they're trying to point to by saying there are no brothers on the wall, right? They're not just merely making a statement. They're not just merely saying we walk in here and all we see are white faces. They're saying in this black neighborhood, in this black community, among these black people who literally are your bread and butter, the psychic violence of entering into spaces in a place that is home to you and not seeing representations of yourself. So I'm thinking about, again, 30 years ago, and the number of black churches in Brooklyn, in this very neighborhood, that still had large stained glass windows of white Jesus, right? What does it mean when the iconic and iconography, right, of your daily life and daily existence doesn't look like you? And so the kind of violence that's even visited, not just on the body in terms of what happens to Radio Raheem, but the psychic damage of these kids growing up in a neighborhood where they don't see anyone who looks like them on the wall.
That actually makes me think of something. I taught Sunday school to 3rd and 4th graders for several years, and I remember when I taught my 3rd and 4th graders that Jesus wasn't white, and they looked at me, and I said, well, he was Palestinian, which also kind of perplexed them as well. But then we got around to brown, but these were black children who had no idea at all who Jesus was as a historical person. And the erasure of that, even from young minds, was really disturbing to me. Am I getting more toward the point that you're aiming at?
That's exactly the point that I'm trying to make. So that, as Sal is saying, I've raised these kids on this food, these kids in the neighborhood, I've fed them, and he's taking a pride in that, and a kind of pride in, look at them, they're thriving and they're growing. And I'm looking at those pictures and I'm saying, yes, but there are other kinds of food, right? And so that inability to see themselves represented. I mean, I'm in a place, we're in a space. I love that we're doing this in this sacred space. There are lots of stained glass windows here. This edifice, this community has had conversations about its stained glass windows, who's represented, who's not represented. And so that question of representation is significant because I think we have to both talk about physical bodies, but also the psychic, right? The spiritual, the kind of psychological damage that I think this community wants to point to, that I think Spike Lee does a really masterful job kind of referencing.
Good.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that's one of Spike Lee's great gifts to us. Because after, decades and decades of Hollywood either misrepresenting people of color or not representing people of color, we've got this wave of great black filmmakers, starting with Spike and John Singleton, and coming up today with Ryan Coogler and Ava DuVernay. I really think that Yolanda's point about if you're not represented, as a white middle-class guy, I've seen myself on the screen my entire life. And it wasn't until recently that I started realizing that my experience was not everybody's experience. That if you're a person of color, that it's entirely possible you could have gone for decades of your life without seeing yourself represented. And it makes me think of what Barry Jenkins, the director of the new Beale Street movie, says. It's, if you don't see yourself on the screen, it is as if you don't exist. And so I have had that incredible, great, good luck for my entire life to see myself represented and to realize that, my life was verified by Hollywood and the entertainment industry. But what Spike gives us here is this incredible sense of the diversity of life and a number of people who maybe we haven't seen represented before. This great movement when people of color start telling their own stories and making their own films.
These are names that I had forgotten. Eleanor Bumpurs, Michael Griffith, Arthur Miller Jr., Edmund Pear, Yvonne Smallwood, and Michael Stewart. And that was 30 years ago. Now, of course, we would add Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland. What's changed, Van?
I think this goes to show that every generation of young black folks has its own canon of those names. I'm sure, and I've been told that during the riots in Detroit, they had people's names, they had their list. A lot has changed in this country. I think if you just look at the material wealth of people, it has increased over the past 50 years. It's increased over the past 30 years. Black people live in different conditions than they did when this film was made. The ghetto, as it's portrayed in lots of different films from the time, doesn't really exist the same way it existed back then. But along with that have been not so great changes, I think. While black folks don't live in the same inner city conditions, that's because they've been gentrified out. That's because now they live in isolation outside of cities, and you have a whole different raft of problems there. And you still have, especially in those communities, especially where you have these sort of disintegrating places where the only authority around is the police. You don't have the local embedded leaders like you do in this film. People die. And more now, I think you see the problem is police brutality. You see these deaths, and on some level, it doesn't seem like things have changed.
I'm just thinking that last year I was driving to work, and about 3 houses down from my house, I got pulled over by the cops. And They wanted to know what I was doing. I'm thinking that I am the least accented, lightest skinned person of hue that one might ever hope to meet. My hometown is Phoenix, Arizona, which is why I have this lack of an accent. But usually when I go back to visit, I get pulled over. I've come to expect it. And I guess that's the thing I'm really looking for, is that if I'm ever going to be able to exist in a world where that doesn't happen anymore.
I was thinking about, as you were sharing your story, I was thinking about the film and the quote-unquote peacemakers, right? The various individuals, and they're usually women, in this film in particular, that are trying to physically serve as a bridge, right? Trying to either keep the police away or wait, no, stop, or don't do that, right? And it reminded me of the cost for Black folk in trying to keep the peace, right? Recognizing peace as a value, wanting peace, but also it comes at a price where you're constantly putting your body on the line, where you're constantly trying to navigate and negotiate. And so I'm thinking about Van's comments and your comments. Things have changed, and yet some things remain the same. If the blue lights come on and I'm in the car, the fear I feel, it's indescribable.
10 and 2. 10 and 2.
And that's where we still are.
And we should probably explain 10 and 2. You want to do that again so people can see? 10 and 2 is where you put your hands on the steering wheel so that the officers can see you at all times. Greg, have you seen any differences in the way that police and communities of color interact in the years that you have been teaching or in the years since this film has come out?
I don't know that I've seen, because I am in this privileged position where when those lights come on, I just go, oh, damn it, that's $60. And Kelly Brown Douglas and I have had this conversation before. I have 2 boys, and I've never had to have the talk with them because I've never thought that we were going to be in a position where even if they were pulled over by police, they were in danger. The one thing that I do hope is changing is kind of revealed by our movie tomorrow night, where we begin to think about what happens when it's not just white people in law enforcement. And we've got some wonderful people to talk about policing and justice and injustice tomorrow afternoon and tomorrow night. And you know what we hope to emerge out of our conversations this weekend is hope, because despair is just too hard to live in. But I'm with Van. It feels like things have changed, but they have not changed nearly enough. And I mean, that would be my hope and prayer as we think about this tonight. What could we do that could make things change? How could we be just a tiny bit braver, particularly those of us who are in positions of privilege and power?
One of the things I'd like to ask that we talked about prior to this evening, what must Black filmmakers do to not only succeed but thrive? What type of work must they do in order to remain creative and to create a thing of beauty in a world that doesn't want to accept that you may be young, gifted, and Black? Van?
Well, there are, I think most people will be hard-pressed to name 5 bad Black directors. There are few, because you don't make it in the industry if you just don't make good stuff, if you aren't great at the craft. There are no black directors or screenwriters who specialize in sort of the popcorn B-movie level type stuff. There are lots of white directors who do that. I can name lots of people who I just hate, who I think make terrible work all the time, and I'm pretty sure you all can too. But there are very few, I think, people in the industry who are black who are kind of universally recognized as being bad. And that tells you right there sort of what the game we're playing really is. It's that you have to be, I hate the old adage, you have to be twice as hard and work twice as fast. But you do. You have to work twice as hard. You look at what Spike did with Do the Right Thing. He, first of all, he's in the movie. Second of all, he's taking all these different elements of black cinema, black drama, and putting it into one package. He's getting the whole entire reason we have this Spike Lee jazz sound is because he gets the Marsalises to come and play for him. He has this. He does. If you look at the credits, he did pieces in the score himself. He did pretty much everything on this film. And if you look at I guess that's a tradition that runs across genres. You look at all these black actors and actresses who were in the film. You look at famous black actors. How many of them can work across different genres, do their whole albums, sing, dance, tell jokes, rap? This is kind of the black tradition in art, is being able to shoulder a burden that would be impossible for white creators. And I think Spike embodies that, but now you have these new people who are on the scene. You have your Kuglers, you have people who can write and direct and produce and act. So I think this film really is sort of a symbol for that burden.
One of the things I want to point out is that 30 years ago, this film was not nominated for Best Picture, and the film that did win Best Picture, Greg?
That would be Driving Miss Daisy. Yeah.
And of course, how ironic, or is it irony, that this year BlacKkKlansman, also a Spike Lee joint, is up for Best Picture, but it's up against
The Green Book.
So I would respond to your question by saying that I think black filmmakers today have an onus to tell the rich diversity of black stories. And that's what I'm seeing now starting to happen that's exciting. Tell the story of the young lovers. Tell the story that is the horror gothic, tell the, raised in the hood story. Tell the, we're black and we're rich. Tell the whole story, right? The diversity of the black experience is as diverse as any other experience. And we need more women, black women filmmakers. And Spike Lee's characterization of women in his films falls flat for me every time, in every film that I've seen of his. There's much to admire and respect about his films, but he flattens his black women characters. And so we have some new filmmakers on the scene telling black women's stories in complicated and interesting ways. And so we pay homage to Spike, to what he has done and is still doing, but there's room for lots of folks at the table.
We have to wrap up our evening. It went really quick, but I'd like to give Greg a chance to respond to creativity in black filmmakers.
Yeah. Well, I think what I would want to do is just say that this weekend we are seeing two really masterful films. And as somebody who has taught film for many, many years, these are two films that I admire tremendously. And in a really great work of art, there's this interplay between the form and the message. And this is a movie that starts off with some bars of Lift Every Voice and Sing, and then it goes right into Fight the Power. And so you've got that collision at the beginning, and you've got all these collisions in the middle, the love-hate monologue, all the way to the two sort of divergent opinions about violence at the end. And it's this incredible film of opposites and contradictions. And what Roger Ebert said about it ultimately is that this is a film that requires you as the viewer to decide what you think about it. And not every film does that, but that's an incredible achievement And so we're going to walk out here tonight, and on the way home, we're going to argue with each other. But it's a good argument. What is the right thing?
That concludes our evening for tonight, but I would like to invite you to come back tomorrow night. We'll all be here with some more friends. We would hope that you would join us as well. The film tomorrow night is BlacKkKlansman, nominated for Best Picture. It is going to start tomorrow night at 6:30. So for all of you who came here at 7, y'all need to come a little bit earlier. We'd love to see you tomorrow night, so I hope you'll come. On behalf of Baylor and the Austin Film Festival and the National Cathedral and my fellow panelists, I want to thank you.